Fleming.
Good morning. We started this journey about 3 weeks ago. I think it was Friday the 27th. We spent a lot of time, about a week and a half, where you came into this courtroom as individuals and you promised this judge, and she instructed you without question, that the incident involving Deborah Clayton couldn't be used today. Period. And each of you promised me, and were made aware perhaps for the first time, that this part of the case is different than the first part. This is not a community message. This is an individual decision that each of you will make on your own. End of story. And after that decision is made, that will be a just verdict. This is not a community message. This is an individual message from you. And as the judge told you, you are never, and she will instruct you, the law says you are never required to vote for death. And I would suggest at the end of this, after I present the evidence to you, you will not find the aggravating circumstances sufficient. It only takes you as an individual to say, based on this case and the circumstances and the things you know now, that they aren't sufficient. And then he gets a life sentence, back to back, life without parole. He's never getting out. You've already decided that. Markeith Loyd is dying in prison by your verdict, without question. The only thing today or tomorrow or Wednesday that you'll have to decide is whether the government in the state of Florida takes his life. You see, Markeith was raised in Carver Shores, an impoverished area of Orlando. His mother, Patricia, met his father, who was in the military, and became pregnant. And with a very short period of time left him because he was an abusive, physically abusive man to her. And he came to Orlando with his mother at the age of 3. And him and his older sister, Dana, were the first children that Patricia had. A single mother who raised him without a male in his life. Now, as he grew up in Carver Shores, what you will learn is that there were men that would come in and out of her life. And that within a very short period of time, him and his sister Dana were raising themselves along with 3 other children that she had. Barry, Giovanna, and Tanya. By 3rd grade, Markeith couldn't read. He was in special classes. Now, by all accounts, you will hear that their family was close, and they are still close today. You'll hear that from his mother, Patricia, who sat throughout this trial over here with her daughters and family members and her son. And she will tell you about Markeith and how much she loves him. Now, you know some of the story because Markeith testified. I counted that he was on the stand for 3.5, 4 hours. Some of it was unorthodox. Some of it made all of us very uncomfortable. And in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about why. But as Markeith continued to grow up in Carver Shores, he had to survive in this environment. At a very young age, this black boy felt the sting of racism. When he first watched Roots, it affected him in a way that may be different than other African Americans around him. And we may have a reason why. And I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. But he was helping raise his brothers and sisters and surviving. So he would steal food so they could eat. And at some point, later on, he started selling drugs, like many African American boys and young men in Carver Shores. At 13 years of age, his mother was able to get out of Carver Shores and move to Pine Hills. But that didn't really change anything for him or the influences of the people that he had around him. And you will hear that although his mother was many times absent when he was growing up, she was a strict disciplinarian, that she would use the cord on him the way she had the cord used on her. And he had trouble in school. And at some point, he got kicked out of school. And he was on the streets selling drugs. From 16 to 22, Markeith Loyd sold drugs. And he would use some of that money to take care of his family, to buy food, to help his brother and sisters out, to help his mom out. And his mom knew that he was selling drugs, and she tried to intervene because there was discord in the schools. He was getting into a lot of fights. There was a theme that the white man was trying to keep him down and targeting him as a person. And that was a consistent theme in his life during this period of time. And so when he was 16 years old, his mother tried to get him institutionalized in a program at a mental health facility. And she took him there and convinced him to stay there for a short period of time. And he convinced her to get him out because he had gone there voluntarily. And it was the one time that he was taken to a mental institution, a facility, And they told his mother he needed long-term care. And it didn't happen. And so the school system failed. His program failed. Everything in his life was not happening the way it should to get this person help. And so when he was 16 years old, the world that he knew, the young men that he hung around, and you'll hear from some of them, said there were two routes for a young black man growing up in Carver Shores, who came from Carver Shores and even in Pine Hills now, where you'll hear at night the family saw KKK out and about. They didn't have that in Carver Shores, but in Pine Hills they did. There were two routes. You either rob or you deal drugs. And he didn't want to rob, so he dealt drugs. The flashy guys that were his peers, the people he looked up to on the streets, the guys with the big wads of cash, driving the nice cars, that was his male influences while he was growing up in Carver Shores, leading to the point where he was selling drugs. That's who he was. Did that happen to everybody? Absolutely not. You have a mom or dad that's there. You have a peer, teacher, family member guiding you. All kinds of reasons why it doesn't happen. But it happens in this community today, and it happened then to Markeith Loyd. And at 16 years of age, he got his first real taste of violence. A drug dealer thought he had stolen a car and kidnapped him and his friend and beat him horribly. You're going to hear about that from the friend, from the family members, of what he looked like after he was beaten horribly. And so up to the point when he was 22 years old, that's when he got his first adult felony conviction, 22 years old. And you're going to hear from that officer. He was sentenced to 4.5 years for that at 22. White police officer, driving in this African-American community, looks and sees that he's speeding, doesn't have a paper tag, turns around. By that time, Markeith, and you heard Markeith's story about this. I brought it out. We didn't have to bring that out to you during his testimony, but I wanted you to hear the story because I knew you were going to hear this story. Markeith pulls the car over, gets out, starts walking away. Police officer stops him. Markeith had just had a significant injury to his wrist, just had surgery. Didn't have his cast on, just had surgery. And so the officer says, "You're under arrest." He was going to arrest him for resisting without violence. And he grabs his hand. And you're going to hear that he grabbed his hand, and that's when the struggle began. And Markeith told him, I have an injury to my hand. I have the transcripts. They gave them to me from that trial. When he came into deposition on this case, he didn't bring that up. But I have the transcripts. And I won't impeach him if he lies. And for that offense, he said, as you heard the theme over and over, not going to take this, not going to lay down. I'm going to fight. And he went to trial, and he was punished with 4.5-year sentence in prison. And about the same time, he was arrested. As a matter of fact, while this trial was going on, he was arrested and charged with the drug case that you heard about. There's no question Markeith Loyd was a drug dealer. But he told you, and you will hear, that those weren't his drugs. They were a buddy of his drugs who kept him at his house. Now, that drug offense is not an aggravating factor. You can't consider that drug offense for the actual drug offense. The only thing you can consider is that he was on probation or parole, and I'll talk to you about that in a little while. But there's no question that he took a lengthy sentence under what he calls, and I don't know if they're going to call their doctor or not, I invite them to call their doctor, racist laws, crack cocaine enhancements, where they're sending young black men to prison for longer periods of time for crack cocaine as opposed to powder. And you'll hear me ask the probation officer about that, because he ended up getting a reduction after he was sentenced for that. That's the world he lived in. That's the world he grew up in. Before that happened, in '96, his cousin Wesley was gunned down. And he was there right after and saw the body and had said to family members, cover him with a blanket, he's cold. This becomes important, this incident with the kidnapping, the incident with his cousin being gunned down, another incident in 2016 when a friend of his was murdered, brutally murdered, the Texas chicken robberies when he was robbed twice. This becomes important because, as I will tell you in a few minutes, the issue of post-traumatic stress becomes extremely important here. You're going to hear from 4 doctors. Dr. Sesta is a neuropsychologist who did really important testing on him, and I'm going to talk to you about that in a second. Dr. Dunn is a psychologist, a social psychologist, who spent a significant time with Markeith and his family. Dr. Campbell is an expert in post-traumatic stress syndrome and post-traumatic stress. And Dr. Mayer is a psychiatrist, and you will hear from him. And what is the theme that you're going to hear from all of these doctors? Something happened to this man, and I'm not saying that before he went to prison this was an issue, but something happened to this man while he was in prison. And you'll hear from his family what they saw and what was different. And here's the most important piece. Dr. Sade, a neuropsychologist, does a forensic test that is objective in nature. This is not their doctor opining his opinion without any test to support it. This is not my other doctors opining their opinions. This is an objective test called the MMPI-2. And Dr. Sade goes there, he gives them this test, and he determines that, number one, if anything, Markeith is underreporting a little bit, which means if he was actually reporting, it would be even more significant. Number two, he's being truthful with his answers. There's a process where they check to see people are malingering and trying to kind of guide people away from the real truth. He's being truthful with his answers. And what that test shows is that Markeith Loyd has a significant delusional disorder with a psychiatric spectrum. A delusional disorder with a psychiatric spectrum. Now think back. Think back. His actions, his words, his thoughts, his poop. Everyone in his family recognizes something is wrong with this man. And so how does that delusional disorder affect him and the way he thinks? It's an enhancement. See, when you think about delusional disorders, it doesn't mean that you're just making stuff up. There could be real stuff, but your thought process connected to that changes because of the delusional disorder. His heightened thought process against the white man, that they're trying to kill him, that the police are trying to kill him, that people are trying to kill him, that Sade Dixon was trying to kill him, that her brother was trying to kill him. All of those things come into play. Now in Florida, that's not a legal defense to first-degree murder unless you are completely insane. And he's not insane. But it is a consideration that you must now put into play as you look back on the events that transpired. As you now think about the circumstances that took place. Because not only is the delusional disorder relevant to mitigation, going back at least to when he left prison, July of 2014 to December 13th, 2016. This convicted felon, as he told you from the stand, was trying to get his life in order. No new offenses. He's working. He's renting a house. But he's still a mentally ill man. And that becomes hugely important leading up to these events. But it also becomes important to the events that took place before then. And then the second issue then becomes, because of the events that transpired in prison, and you'll hear that someone tried to kill him in prison. Family found out about it. That when he gets out, you have the events of him being robbed twice. You have the events that transpired before he went to prison, because we don't even know all the stuff that happened during this period of time, this 14 years in prison, but one can imagine. But you had the 16-year-old being kidnapped and brutally beaten, witnessing the murder, or not witnessing, but being at the murder scene when his cousin was gunned down. The 2016 where his friend was killed. You have his mental illness, the delusional disorder, and then you have trauma. You're going to hear from Dr. Campbell. And that becomes important because you are going to hear the word hypervigilance. Hypervigilance. That's something that happens when someone has been traumatized and they start viewing things through a prism that is unlike mine and yours. And so Markeith Loyd, when he got to that house on the 13th, not only was delusionally disordered, but had hypovigilance and trauma. And you will be able to consider those factors when you are determining, one, the sufficiency of the aggravation in this case, and two, the weight of the aggravation. And you will also be able to consider all of those in mitigation. So that's not only setting off the weight of the events, and you are the fact finders. You make the determination, whatever the facts are. I'm suggesting those two factors, when you hear from the doctors and the family members, must be considered as both mitigation and to reduce the weight of aggravation. Again, this is not an excuse for the murders. Your verdict was just based on your belief system. This is about whether you are going to sanction the killing of a human being without considering all the facts now that you have. Because I couldn't give you those facts before, because I said they're not a legal defense. But they are something you can consider, as I talked about. If I can have a moment, Judge?
Sure.
At the end of this case, you as individuals will have to sit down with yourself and decide, first, whether this is the kind of case that the community thinks is sufficient that the death penalty should be appropriate with. That's an individual decision. And if you say no, it's life in prison twice, back to back. He's never getting out of prison. He's dying in prison. Then you will have to weigh the aggravating factors and decide which ones are proven. All the aggravating factors come from the case itself or the battery on the law enforcement officer, or the fact that he was on probation. That's it. Nothing else. Nothing else. Period. Including Sergeant Clayton. And once you look at those factors, you have to decide whether they were proven beyond a reasonable doubt, which clearly they probably were. I mean, we know what happened. More importantly, the weight you assign those aggravating factors if you get past sufficiency. And then you get to look at the mitigating factors. And you decide the mitigating factors. And as I indicated, you can offset some of these mitigating factors with this mental illness, the delusional disorder, psychotic spectrum, the post-traumatic stress syndrome, which I'm placing in front of you for a number of reasons, most importantly to show as an explanation what went wrong with this man. And you heard him for 3.5 hours. You saw him for 3.5 hours. You got a taste of Markeith Loyd for 3.5 hours. And I suggest it's completely consistent now that you know. And once you hear the doctors explain it, it will even be more clear for you. And so you get to weigh the mitigating factors and you decide what weight. We may give you 18 mitigating factors. His family loves him. He loves his family. The psychiatric disorders, things that he had to deal with, poverty and racism. All those things are going to be placed before you over the next 2 days through family member witnesses and expert witnesses. And then you get to decide what you give weight to each of those. You can give one more than the other. You can give them collectively. It's up to you individually. You have to sit down with yourself. And then after that, you decide you're going to weigh them. And the law says, as we talked about in jury selection, if you find the mitigating factors outweigh the aggravating factors individually, within yourself individually, you must give life. If you believe the aggravating factors outweigh the mitigating factors, you may vote for death, but you never have to, because there's a fallback position that you get to take, and nobody can take that away from you. Nobody can take that away from you. And that's, listen, I want to vote for life. I don't have to tell you why. It may be a moral decision. It may be something that's tied to you as a human being, that's personal. It's up to you completely.
Sustained.
And after you make that decision, then the only just verdict here is life in prison for both of those murders, where he never gets out. He dies in prison.
Thank you, Mr. Lemon.